أن نحضر كل إنسان كاملا في المسيح يسوع.
Dear viewers, welcome to LogosTV Coptic Civilization program. I'm Michael Saad. Today's episode is entitled Poetry in the Diaspora. Poetry is an important topic in the Bible. Actually, a few books of the Bible are poetry. Book of Psalms, Book of Song of Songs, and others. And in our modern time, we have, as a poet, His Holiness Pope Shenoda III, preceded by his mentor, Archdeacon Saint Habib Girgis. In the diaspora, the tradition continues. Today's episode is a dialogue with Dr. Sheri Shenoda, who is a Coptic pediatrician in the Los Angeles area. Welcome, Dr. Sheri Shenoda.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's an honor and pleasure having this. You kindly accepted my invitation to appear on Coptic Civilization program. And if you would allow me to introduce you, besides your profession as a pediatrician and wife and mother and servant in the church in the Los Angeles area, Dr. Shenoda made a name for herself as a novelist and poet. Her 2021 novel, The Light Keeper, has received warmly in the genre of religious science, fiction, and fantasy. That book, we'll talk about it briefly at the end of the episode because it's a fiction rather than poetry. In 2022, University of Nebraska Press published her second book, Mummy Eaters, which is also showing behind me on the screen. And that book was long listed for the 2022 National Book Award in Poetry and was awarded the Sillerman First Book Prize in African Poetry and was the winner of an American Book Award. Dr. Shenoda, let us start the dialogue with giving us an idea about this fabulous book, which I enjoyed reading it. So many poems that you wrote, and you established yourself as a poet, and fascinating book. And would you kindly explain to us what is Mummy Eaters? And my reading tells me that it has been a European practice in the 16th and 17th century. Could you tell us, please, more about this practice and why you decided to write about this seemingly strange topic? Please.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It was lovely. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, we know that Europeans ate ancient Egyptian human remains, so what we call mummies as medicine. Mummies were thought to contain the powerful life force of these ancient beings. And so this book, Mummy Eaters, follows the path of an imagined ancestor through her death and mummification as she races her way to the afterlife. And they had to race to the afterlife through all of the different stages before the body decomposed. So mummification essentially was an attempt to delay decomposition, to buy time. They preserved the body to give the soul enough time to find itself in the afterlife. And their version of the afterlife was called the Field of Reeds, which was the soul of the Nile River. So running parallel to her storyline is the violation and desecration of this European practice of mummy eating. It struck me as an apt metaphor, I think, for the consumption of colonialism later on, that the consumption of one people group by another. And the desecration sinks even deeper when you really think about the importance of the incarnated body to the ancient Egyptians. They couldn't enter the afterlife without it. So it was very important to them.
You present your book as a vehicle for truth. Why, in general, do you see poetry and fiction as vehicles for truth? And that also runs in your novel, The Lightkeeper. Please.
Yeah, so I feel like you could write an essay about the importance of this practice or the historical significance. You could connect this metaphor of mummy eating and colonialism. But I feel like people respond with more empathy and compassion to stories. As humans, I feel like stories, whether it's fiction or poetry, they paint a picture for us that can carry the weight of truth that maybe people wouldn't accept in a non-fictional account or would be harder to digest. So writing for me is a way to share truth and beauty and goodness. You don't always write about the happiest topics, but I try to tell the truth, which is what I think we owe each other. So, and I think we can acknowledge darkness in the times, but still show that there's goodness and truth in the world. It reminds me of a line of poetry by one of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry. He says, "Be joyful, though you know the facts." So the facts may seem bleak if we're paying attention, especially, but we know that Christ has risen. And I try in my small way to show beauty and truth. And I think that's the best that we can offer to a world that's hurting. And I know that we've spoken a little bit about this, Dr. Saad, but Christ spoke in parables too. So I think there was a reason for that.
That resonates well with the Last Supper, actually. Christ was telling his disciples sad stories, meeting the devil. The prince of this world is coming, and he has nothing to me in me, but Christ is surrendering to persecution and the cross. At the same time, he talks about joy, and your joy will be fulfilled, and nobody will take away your joy from you. That rhymes well or consistent with the poet that whatever you mentioned about him, Wendell. Be joyful, although you are meeting sad facts, right? Yeah. But now in Mummy Eaters, you write about desecration of the land and desecration of the dead. The mummies taken around the world. The land is digged, and these mummies are corpse of people who died a few thousand years ago, and now they are on display here and there. What is the relationship between the desecration of the land and desecration of people?
Yeah, so back to Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry writes an essay. He has a book of agrarian essays. He was a farmer. living in Kansas. And in one of his essays, it's called A Native Hill, he quotes an account of some early American settlers creating a road. So this is before Kansas was really settled. And so this large group of men are creating a road, and they're basically trying to get from point A to point B with the shortest distance. So they're plowing through the land. And at night, what they do is they create a large clearing. So they cut down a lot of trees and they make a large fire. And so after he reads this account, he's thinking to himself, what would the Native Americans have done in this situation? Well, they probably would have moved with the curvature of the land, whether there's a river there or trees, instead of making a direct path, which he says is a type of violence against the land, clearing directly without respect to any of the natural landmarks. So he mentions that, and then he says they wouldn't have cut down a lot of trees to make a large fire. They would have made a small clearing, made a small fire, and then created a shelter for themselves because they saw themselves as stewards of the land. And so he says in kind of conclusion, one, that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And the other point that he makes is that we still haven't arrived to America because we don't view the land with the same responsibility that a steward would. So in order to be from a place, we have to take on whatever sins have been committed on the place and in a way redeem the land. And this is how we start the process of restitution. And I would just add a line from Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. He says, there's only one way to salvation, and that's to make yourself responsible for all men's sins. As soon as you make yourself responsible in all sincerity for everything and everyone, you will see at once that it really is so. So it brings me just to the beginning of this book. In the very beginning, there is an invocation or kind of an opening poem, opening prayer, and it tells the story of a monk in Japan. His name was Koyu Abe, and in the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, he planted thousands of sunflowers, so just fields of sunflowers, and they were thought to absorb the toxicity from the soil. So back to your question about the desecration of the land, I'm just going to read a couple of lines, if that's okay. So in this invocation, after the introduction of this story about this monk, it says, would that I could plant in handfuls of seeds, myself offered in peace. And then it ends with, plant me until we bud forgiveness, the ground hollowed. And from lamentation, our song swells, from dark earth, an ascendant praise. So it really is an opening prayer to be used in the process of healing and in the redemption of the land and the people that live on it. So I think of this as a symbol for forgiveness. The book was my way of kind of processing that. The book opens and ends with the concept of forgiveness. And I wanted to link the ideas of the desecration of the land and the desecration of the human body. The ancient Egyptians had such a reverence for the human body as sacred matter. And there was a link for them between the sacredness of the body and the sacredness of the land.
Thank you for reading for us that poem. Interesting indeed. And that brings also the very closely related topic, which is dehumanization. You have a theme or a series of poems in the book on dehumanization. And I don't know if you meant in your subconscious or consciously to relate this to suffering of the Copts over, say, 20 centuries or so, at least most of them. If Coptic experience over these centuries are presented in your poetry, And if you can speak from that perspective, please.
Absolutely. I think in stories, so another story comes to mind. The story of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I think a lot of people are familiar with it, but kind of in short, it's about a man who essentially sells his soul to the devil. And his soul, so he doesn't age, his body doesn't age. He stays young and healthy and handsome, but his painting, the portrait of himself, ages. And all of his sins are projected onto the portrait. So he keeps the portrait in his attic where no one can see it because he's lived such a degenerate life that the portrait is very ugly. And so one day his friend, his close friend, accidentally sees the picture. So he goes up to the attic and he sees it and he's horrified because all of the sins that this man has committed are very visible on the portrait. The portrait is hideous. So his friend is just overwhelmed and horrified by him. And so Dorian can't stand the thought that somebody knows what his soul really looks like. And so he kills him. And what strikes me about this story, in the text that, in Oscar Wilde's text, he says, Dorian looked at the dead thing. And so he doesn't see his friend as human anymore. He had, in some sense, in some way, to dehumanize him in order to commit this terrible crime and to murder him. So in the Coptic tradition, the Orthodox tradition, we believe that humans are image bearers. We bear the image of God. And if God is love, a lack of love distorts the image. So in order for us to do any sort of violence to each other, I think we have to dehumanize each other. Love humanizes, a lack of love distorts the image. And so in the series of silencing poems in Mummy Eaters, I try to explore the ways in which we silence each other. And in silencing, that we in some sense deny the other people's humanity and begin the process of erasing them.
Interesting. I thought, would it be applicable that there are two movements here, the Copts as victims and the Copts as the persecutor? Are you talking about both? Or what? I mean, you mentioned something about the Copts dehumanizing others, or the Copts being dehumanized by the persecutor.
The latter.
The latter, yeah. Because, but that is a good point to push back. You push back from that perspective. Why are you dehumanizing me? Is that a valid question? Consistent with your poetry?
Yeah, I explored several different periods of time when Copts were silenced. So there's the Roman occupation, there's the British occupation, there's the encounter of Copts with Islam. And then at the very end, I try actually to talk a little bit about how we can speak kind of beyond the silence. I never like to speak about trauma in isolation. As a pediatrician, especially, I find it more helpful to talk about any sort of trauma with the addendum of how do we rehabilitate, or how do we move past trauma? How do we resolve the trauma or learn from it and grow and thrive? Because we all want to live a good life. And not dwell in whatever cycle of trauma has existed in the past. But so the series of silencing poems actually ends with one where there's some ability to speak past silence, which is what I hope for anyone who's gone through something that has been difficult.
Yeah, that brings the subject actually of poetry as a means for restoration, of self-consciousness, of healing, because when the victim expresses themselves in poetry, it has some kind of a medicine or inspiration to push back, to struggle, to convince the persecutor, change their heart, and so on. So poetry definitely is a motivational vehicle. As I mentioned, His Holiness Pope Shenoda III as a poet, and Archdeacon Habib Gerges wrote about 100 poems that could be eligible for community singing. Same with his Pope Shenoda. And others, we have quite a number of Coptic poets, including in the diaspora. I remember Matthew Shenoda, who is now professor at Brown University, I think, in the area of poetry. And I interviewed him, or arranged for an interview for him about 20 years ago for Watani newspaper. So you are a second generation in that sense of, which proves that the Coptic diaspora is extending the richness of Coptic poetry. Generation after generation. I mentioned in this context, now we have Habib Gerges, Pope Shenoda, Matthew Shenoda, and Sheri Shenoda, unrelated. Shenoda, oh my goodness, 3 Shenodas in a row, unrelated by blood, but related by spiritual and connection, and of course affiliation to the Coptic Church. Great. Maybe the name Shenoda inspires poetry. Well, the Archbishop, he's named the Dean of Coptic Literature.
Yeah, wow, I didn't know that title.
Yeah, he is described by scholars today as the Dean of Coptic Literature. And his legacy is of immense magnitude. The problem is that it was not discovered for one reason or another until recently, and it's spread around the world. And he is at the same caliber, they say, very close to us in the caliber to Athanasius and Cyril, very close, if not at par with them. So scholarship will bring about the certainty of this. So very interesting. Besides your theme of dehumanizing, or series of poems in the book, you have also another theme on mistranslation. And I agree with you. It looks you are claiming that mistranslation is dangerous, and I agree. I cannot agree less. Or I cannot agree more, either way. What do you mean by that? Why is it dangerous?
So silencing, I think, denies the humanity of the person in front of us to some extent. And there's a spectrum of silencing in the book. But in pediatrics, for instance, the most common form of child abuse is not what people might think. It's not physical abuse. It's actually neglect. So sometimes we mistranslate because we can't be bothered, right? We don't intend to do harm, but denying people language, mispronouncing their names, even though it seems innocuous, it's the beginning of the spectrum of silencing. So I try to give a glimpse in the book, for instance, of how catastrophic a mistranslation can be. So one example I give is my great aunt Marie, Tita Marie. She had a pacemaker placed without her consent when she was in the hospital, for example, because they sent her a Spanish-speaking interpreter rather than an Arabic one. And actually the title of the book points to a mistranslation. So mummy was mistranslated from the Persian, where that word refers to medicinal bitumen, which is a viscous plant material. You could make an argument that the practice of mummy eating might not have occurred if not for the mistranslation. And in the same vein, if we didn't neglect one another with respect to the spoken word, I think in some sense we would not consume each other figuratively in the same way. And then, of course, there's the rest of the spectrum of silencing, the deliberate kinds, the more obvious ones, the more violent ones. But I think it starts with mistranslation, neglect, and the really small things that maybe don't seem as important.
Well, please always feel free or enrich us to with reading verses or couplets from your poems every now and then. We to enrich our episode.
Okay.
And in another set of poems, you talk about, or you sort of create a thought experiment surrounding the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten.
Yeah.
And speaking of him as a monotheist, although, of course, we know that he was considered by many of his contemporaries to be a heretic, of course, at that time, and even today, people describe others as heretics randomly or with some superficial reasons. What was your purpose here? And what parallels were you trying to create between ancient Egyptian mythology and our current Coptic tradition?
Yeah, so Akhenaten, there's a lot of scholarly speculation about, as you said, whether he adopted a monotheistic worldview, maybe as a political power grab. Some people even questioned his sanity, and many people at the time thought of him as a heretic and tried to erase his legacy. But I wanted to, in the book, as a thought experiment, as you say, imagine another possibility that maybe he did believe in a single God. There's a really interesting poem that's attributed to Akhenaten. It's called The Great Hymn to the Aten. The Aten is the sun disk that he didn't actually worship the sun disk itself. He worshipped the manifestation of God through the sun disk. So I had, in a play on words, written a lesser hymn to the one God. And he says, creator of sun, sky, sea, and everything therein, in the sun disk Aten, manifest. So it's not that he's worshiping the sun disk itself, but he's worshiping the one behind it. And actually, some people compare the great hymn to the Aten to Psalm 104. And that's the one that begins, praise the Lord, O my soul. There are a lot of similarities actually between the two. And then you also mentioned regarding the parallels between ancient Egyptian mythology and the Coptic tradition. I feel like there's maybe not enough time to go into all of it, but the one that's most important to me is the mythology of the ancient Egyptians was not, as people sometimes think, oriented toward death. They were not obsessed with death. It was an orientation toward the resurrection. So mummification was an attempt to preserve the body, to buy time for the soul to find itself and to attain the afterlife. So it was all preparation for the resurrection. And this is, as Coptic Christians, we live in the light of the resurrection. Our lives are supposed to be oriented toward preparation for resurrection. And so in this poem also, called From Mummification to the Incarnation, it says, is it holy or heresy to hate the house that holds the soul? There was a lot of hatred at the time, in the time of Plato especially, toward the body. But we are not taught to hate the human body. We're taught that that it serves a purpose, that it's sacred matter. And then later in the poem it says, did not the resurrection begin at the moment of incarnation in sacred matter? And from death to entombment, the ancients labored, preserving all they could in preparation for the resurrection. So I think that for me is the most important parallel. between the ancient Egyptian mythology and our Coptic tradition right now. Is this orientation, everything in their lives was oriented toward resurrection.
Indeed, yeah. I heard that, and we presented in a previous episode that what is the West called the Book of the Dead is actually the Book of Life, because it describes the journey of the soul to eternal life. But of course, a Westerner found the book in a coffin, so he associated it with the coffin and death and called it the Book of the Dead. True, but the book is 99.9% about a journey to life.
Yes.
True, if death is the door,
yes,
let it be. I mean, so interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you captured this in your book of Mummy Eaters, the poems by Sheri Shenoda. And you also handled the issue of the treasures of Egypt being scattered around the world in museums here and there. And of course, treasures of any country scattered around the globe.
yes.
Now, what do you think these treasures belong to which country? The host country today, or the country in which these treasures were created in the first place? Should we have or continue to have these mega museums, call it encyclopedic museums like the British Museum in London, where you find a little bit of everything from China to Egypt to India to the rest of the world, or what? Where to go from here? But in terms of your poems, and if you please read us more and more of your poems.
Yes. So the simple answer, I think, is I think the treasures of Egypt or any country belong in that country. And that's sort of simple answer, but I think it's fine to have some works in museums around the world. It enriches, I think, other people's understanding of other people's cultures, but not entire temples, or more significant works, like the bust of Nefertiti, for instance. But I think another issue that is worth also grappling with, in particular, when we think about ancient Egypt, is whether human remains actually have to be displayed at all. Do we really have to display mummified remains? Can we not display a sarcophagus, for instance, and give the human remains a dignified burial? I understand wanting to study them, but I think there's also a place for a conversation about maybe not displaying human remains. There's a poem also called Descendant Names Modern Mummy Eaters, and it brings up encyclopedic museums. So it says, we are much more progressive now. We politely unravel displaced mummies in sanitized basements of encyclopedic museums. And then later says, we gobble them with our eyes beside CT scans of their insides in a civilized cybernetic unwrapping. So, I kind of imagine having mummies in museums is a little bit of modern mummy eating. So I think there's also a place to have that conversation about whether that's even necessary. But to answer your first question directly, I think the treasures of Egypt belong in Egypt for the most part.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, it makes sense. Although the issue has been mitigated a little by the technology and the internet and websites, and that whatever in any museum in the world today has the potential of being on display on the internet and shared by the entire world. So actually it mitigated the issue, because now if the British Museum returns some of the treasures to Egypt, the British Museum can still display on the internet all such treasures, and there is no what used to be a danger that things will disappear. You have an electronic copy. If the original disappears, you have the substitute. So somewhat the problem may be more manageable today because of this technological advance. I also noticed in your book the theme of forgiveness almost throughout the book, and that is, I'm not surprised. You're a Christian, you're a Copt, you're a living and proactive member of the church. How does forgiveness factors in the theme of unity, as you express it in the book? How does it factor in the theme of unity in the family, in the community, in the church, in the nation, in the world, which it's a desperate topic, subject, issue that especially pronounced when everybody's complaining we have no peace. And now is forgiveness an important element of bringing peace? What's your take as in the poems?
I just want to qualify actually that I think forgiveness is the way to deal with conflict after it has already occurred. So I'm not talking about forgiveness during an active conflict. I think when there is an active conflict, it's the time to be active. And even in the Bible and Ecclesiastes, there is a time for everything. So there's the importance of ending the conflict first. But then afterwards, I'm very interested in how do we deal with the after effects of trauma. So the book starts with the invocation, which we talked about pulling up the toxicity in the soil. The soil is also, our hearts or our consciences. And so we want to pull up the toxicity, but it also ends with forgiveness. And I wanted to just quote very briefly, this is from Maya Angelou, and she says, "I believe in anger. Anger is like fire. It can burn out all the dross and leave some positive things. But what I don't believe in is bitterness. Forgiveness is imperative because you don't want to carry the weight earned." So Mummy Eaters ultimately is about silencing of maybe the people that don't get to write the history books throughout history into modern times. In the Coptic tradition, which finds its roots deep in the heart of ancient Egypt, there has been much suffering and attempted silencing. But ultimately, I think this is a book about processing marginalization and forgiveness, and about, as we said earlier, learning to speak from the silence and speak past the silence. And as you had mentioned earlier, poetry, I think, is almost an act of defiance. It can be an act of resistance. So learning to take your language and to use it in this, wield it in this way, can be an act of defiance. And actually, this whole series, I don't know if we've spoken about this, but this whole series of books, which is put forth by the African Poetry Book Series, by Professor Kwame Dawes and Professor Matthew Shenoda are really active in this. But it is an act of defiance to create African poetry. There isn't as much African poetry as you could say there should be. So this entire series actually is that kind of speaking after silence.
Yes, 2 points here. Starting from the last point, that poetry can be the voice to the voiceless. Mm-hmm. And indeed, the victim need someone else, so occasionally at least, the victim need others to articulate their plight, their to come to their help, to raise awareness of their problems, to awaken the conscience even of the persecutor, awaken their conscience, and if at all possible, yeah. So thank you for this. And the second point that you mentioned about forgiveness as at the time of forgiveness. There is time for forgiveness and time for struggle against the persecution. And that brings to us the greatest, perhaps of our time, greatest example is in the South African Revolution against apartheid. The Black community, when they took over power, Nelson Mandela, then they talked about forgiveness. They offered forgiveness. They practiced forgiveness to the best human possible and practice. And that was remarkable and still a role model for the world to follow. Before concluding the episode, I want to go back to your other book, which is a novel, The Light Keeper. If you would kindly give us a brief idea, because the topic today is about poetry, but this is a novel, but I don't want to miss the opportunity of having you in the program to give us a few minutes idea about the novel. Of course, we don't force you. We will prevent you from volunteering to tell us the secret or the final conclusion of the novel, but at least whet our appetite.
Okay, sure. If I may, I just wanted to say one last thing about poetry. I think it's also really important for one group advocating for another to make sure that they are not just speaking for them, but allowing them a chance to speak about their own plight. That was the only other thing I just wanted to mention. I think it helps in the process of when we talk about reparations. I think it's really important to give the people that have experienced whatever it is, the opportunity to articulate. But regarding The Light Keeper, so this was a fantasy, and it explores free will and our ability to love in the face of impending loss. So it's a story about a lighthouse keeper who is ageless, and she's out of time. She moves through time tending lighthouses, and she has very limited free will until she has an encounter with the keeper of all lights, who is wisdom, who's a type of Christ. And then her life changes. So on the surface, it's a time travel mystery with a little bit of a love story, but it's actually about free will. And it's about uncertainty. And it is the beginning of my conversation with God about why suffering exists in the world. So without any spoilers, that's what The Light Keeper is about.
Yes, I look forward to reading it myself. And it's a fascinating a novelty in the novel, and I look forward because of its rich meaning, as you described. But also, I read reviews about it, and so on. This brings us to the conclusion of the episode, and if I may invite you to give us a concluding remark.
Sure. So I think ultimately, Mummy Eaters, the book, hinges on this broad kind of unwritten question of what would our past, which includes colonialism, or our future, with all the existential crises that we're facing now, what would the past or the present or the future look like if we believed that the other person was human? Would we still consume each other? And it feels like my life's work depends on the answer to those questions. And ultimately, anything I write is about becoming more human. So The Light Keeper is about her becoming human. Mummy Eaters is about us becoming human. And I think if I had to summarize my work, think that would be an adequate summary.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You brought honor and prestige to my program, Coptic Civilization, and to Logos TV. We, for several reasons, but if I may mention one or two, that you are a role model for the Coptic diaspora in a specific field, poetry and storytelling and fiction writing. And beside your profession as pediatrician, successful pediatrician and responsibilities for the family, you present you raise the bar. And for people like myself to take you as a role model, and it also assure us of God's gift and God's plan and God's providence in the Coptic diaspora. Beside God's love for humanity, and that you are serving humanity in general, one specific Coptic element in your endeavor, and of course it's obvious in the poetry book and also in the novel. That another point I may mention, that poetry and literature in general has a role in the dialogue between civilizations.
Yes.
And even in contemporary time, between this civilization of the East and that civilization of the West, or North and South geographically, but also across the millennium. You brought to us ancient Egyptian civilization, you brought it to our current time in terms of issues, in terms of physical, material culture, you name it. So the role of literature and poetry as one form of language literature and human expression, you actually brought it to life in the program and in your your brainchild, children, your brainchild and other child. And may God reward you. Again, please accept my gratitude.
You're too kind, Dr. Saad. Thank you so much. Your words are so kind. And for anyone out there who is not writing or painting or engaging in creative work, I feel like the Coptic diaspora is so rich and people are doing so many wonderful things. I just encourage people to put their work out. Sometimes we feel like we're not, quote, creative, but I feel like that's not from God. Creativity is our birthright, and people are doing really wonderful things, and I look forward to seeing more of what everyone is working on.
Indeed. Thank you again and again.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dear viewers, you have been with Logos TV Coptic Civilization program. The episode is entitled Poetry in the Diaspora. We had a wonderful time with Dr. Sheri Shenoda, a poet and a novelist with distinguished career in both pediatrics and literature. See you next episode of Logos TV. I'm Michael Saad.
Logos